Welcome to Eminazhichiget, a podcast that celebrates Anishinaabeg leaders from across the Great Lakes. Eminazhichiget translates as a person who does good things for others, and it's a program of the Michigan-based nonprofit Title Track. Miskopwaaganikwe Indigenous, Nimki Indodum, Inde Indao. I'm Holly T. Bird, co-executive director of Title Track and host of Eminazhichiget. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Title Track's series of Eminazhichiget, the podcast where we interview leaders in Michigan who are Anishinaabeg and are doing what we call good things in the community. And this is an interesting podcast because we often reach out to people, and most of our community leaders don't want to be interviewed because they're humble people, and that's a trait in our community that we honor. And Leora is no different. So I'm so excited to introduce Leora Lynn Tadgerson, who's of proud Finnish and Sami heritage and a member of Miskopwaaganikwe Bay Mills and Wikwemikong First Nations. She is a director of Reparations and Justice at the Episcopal Diocese of Northern Michigan. And her role is focusing on truth-telling, racial equity through restorative justice, reconciliation research from the Native American boarding school era, and place-based community work bridge building as a tribal liaison. Her research involves the Michigan-based Indian boarding school experience and the Episcopal-run schools where she serves as chair for the MW 062 Executive Council Committee for Indigenous Boarding Schools and Advocacy. Through her research, she hopes to aid in the healing of Native hearts, and in her spare time, she can be found with her partner, Ty, and 4 boys, Quinn, Shiloh, Evan, and Jack. So welcome, Leora, to our illustrious podcast, where we humbly request your words and your wisdom on these very important issues. And if you want to introduce yourself a little bit further, talk a little bit about who you are, and correct anything that I said wrong, I would be so appreciative.
No, that was really wonderful. It was very kind. Thank you for introducing me. And I do want to say, on the Bushu, Indigenous Miskopwaaganikwe Leora Tadgerson, Shakanashimo, Mikanakadam, Gashpini, Benjaka. It always just feels proper, doesn't it, to be utilizing our language in every instance.
Thank you so much, and I love hearing that. I'm new to your language, which doesn't roll off my tongue quite as easily as it seems to for you. And I've always appreciated hearing you speak it because it sounds beautiful coming from you. And so, yes, please forgive any of my mistakes. Elders, please forgive any of my mistakes.
Girl, we're all learning. Come on now.
You may be related through the Fish clan, but I probably still speak Spanish better, but I'm trying. I'm gonna get there one day. So, Leora, as we move forward in this discussion, I do want to ask you first a little bit about where you're from and who's Leora?
Well, I grew up in Wikwemikong, Michigan, so really right close to Marquette and right close to Lake Superior, K through 12, and then I went to Northern Michigan University and surprisingly went for an art degree for photography. But what in the heck are you going to do with the photography in the middle of the woods? Not a whole lot, not make a living. So I also got my Native American Studies minor, which probably was, a little more fulfilling for my heart. Well, in my mind, I learned so much. And then I was able to go back and get my master's for an interdisciplinary degree, though, because I was in love with education, but it just wasn't enough. I wanted to understand how to help heal our community at different capacities in addition with that. So instead of just education administration with an emphasis on Native American education, it was mixed with like a community bridge building aspect, because the work that I'm doing now is, I would call it interdisciplinary. You mentioned it in my bio, which was wonderful in my introduction, but it's a very interesting and strange role. because we completely just created it because there was a need in our community. And what that need is for bridge building, because here and in so many other places, not just the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but there are these communities that historically have been very divided, purposefully divided, right? Oppressor and oppressed. And that was for the assimilation, that was for, land conquest, etc. So now we're in this very destructive phase of leftovers, right? Our reality is the leftovers, and it's very confusing because we don't have a manual of how to heal. The oppressor and the oppressed. Nobody understands how to heal without learning. And so that's what my role is, really, is to be a communicator, communicate with the tribes, with tribal people, and ask, what are your needs? How are you hurting? How would you like to heal? What's appropriate, And then talk with the churches, like the Episcopal Diocese specifically is what I start with. And that service area is the entire Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And we unpack the harm done so that folks understand what that history is and the racial disparities that we have today as Native people. And then once we get into that mode of culturally competent, then we understand how the diocese can position itself, what that role is, instead of like how contemporarily a lot of different religious organizations are going in with a savior syndrome mentality and unaware of the harm being done with that. So with the diocese here, we are very aware of that savior syndrome and not utilizing that, right? We want to tread lightly, and we want to understand what the role is, what that specifically that white role is, to be able to create authentic systems change for reconciliation. Because I always say that we're in a reconciliation research era. We're so not in reconciliation yet. We're in truth telling, very beginning of truth telling, but reconciliation, gosh, it's going to be a while. So we're definitely in reconciliation research. That's what I heavily, go into.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I want to touch on a couple of things that you talked about, because that's a lot. I feel like sometimes when we're in this research and reconciliation period, where it's almost like we're trying to figure out how to save the world, and it's a tall order, isn't it? We're trying to right 500 years of wrongs. And so you have my vote, on trying to do that. But going back to that space where we talk about healing, quite often people think it's just us as Indigenous people that need healing from colonization. Can you go a little bit into why it's not just us?
Absolutely. So I always try to think about things when I'm talking with my kids, right? Because I have 13, 10, 9, and then like a year. But I always want to think about these things from their perspective, right? So I try not to get too like academic or wordy or anything. And I just try to be real. I try to be very human with them. So that's what I want to do with folks in every aspect. So when America was formed from a Western perspective, these folks were not just happy-go-lucky coming on over here. They were coming from hurt. They were coming from very different oppression and pain. Not the same that they put onto the folks here, onto the different Indigenous populations here, but they were coming from hurt, and they brought that hurt along with them when they migrated over here. And hurt people are going to hurt folks, right? And so they didn't come over with a clean slate. Rather, they were coming in with that pain and then forming these different colonies and still traveling about in their mode of pain. There was never an era of healing for the very beginning of America, and it was messy. For folks that are historians, it was messy, the beginning of America. That was messy now in aspects. But so when folks say that it's just the Native people that need to heal, it's still this very, very old settler colonialism pain and hurt that still needs to heal also, because there was always this aspect of domination, right? And that's coming really from the doctrine and discovery that disposed of so much in so many different aspects of our current America. And if we are unable to understand them, if we're not able to unpack those as, American citizens, then how are we supposed to fix that pain? So I always say that, of course, it's not just Native people, but all the people. And I'm not just saying natives and whites, but I'm saying all people, all races of people. But definitely, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we know from history that we've heard, we've all been raised with more European history than we have with our own Native American history, which is unfortunate. And we're trying to also, you know, make that better, have a more complete history. So we all know, but European history was pretty bloody, and all around the world. I mean, the wars, the hierarchy and the patriarchy. Yeah, that I've never really thought of it that way. And I love that you pointed that out about the hurt that came over here. Um, and I also have heard elders say, when the people did come over and participate in genocide or participate in oppression, that they were still further harming themselves, because you can't do that to people and not hurt your soul. Would you agree with that?
Oh my goodness, so much, so much. And it's interesting to look at that into the perspective that I work with, right? Because I work with a lot of boarding school survivors, and we curate these spaces for them to be able to open up about their stories and about their needs now, right? And so we build that, it's capacity building for safe communities for those survivors and descendants. But they mention that a lot about how a person of God, how someone that was supposed to be protecting them, taking care of them, bringing them into their home, how they could be so evil, how they could do so much hurt. How can a person do it, right? When we have to realize that these people weren't your average person. You're you're missing. They're missing what we have now. They're missing that love, and they're missing sanity.
And yeah, that's so true when you're dealing with survivors who um, are taught to respect people of faith, whether it's by fire or, naturally. I know we as Indigenous people were very spiritual and respected our elders and our people who guided us in that way. Um, that would be really harmful and really hurtful. And of course, if we think about it as hearts, right? All of these hearts that are hurting. So thank you for really pointing that out and making it a whole perspective on how that's done. And one thing you talk about is being a bridge. And in this way, and in the work that you do, what is a bridge? What does a bridge do?
And what I mean by that, I'll give you an example. So there was a really cool grant that we were working with this past year, and it was they call it, from the church perspective, they call it creation care. And they want to care for all of God's creation, right? All of the animals, all the plants, etc. But this one specifically was earth care based creation care. And it was written before I came on board, and then I came on and I just kind of, help foster it. But we were supposed to be working with the 5 different tribes of the UP and asking what their 3 top earth-based pieces were that they wanted to work on, right? What is your most what's your top priority? And then we were going to give them funding to be able to do that work. Now, from a Native perspective, they're like, what the heck is creation care? You're like, what are you talking about? And then they would see this as the church coming in and giving charity, putting their nose where it doesn't belong. Because why would we want your funding? We're doing just fine. We know exactly how to curate our lands, right? And so there was this, right? There were button heads, and I was understanding clearly what was going on, but they just weren't speaking the same language. So unpacking that with both of them, understanding that. So when this was written, who was it that had a consultation with the tribes? And then they realized none of us had consultation with the tribes. And so really, when I talk about bridge building, and I am talking about translating, being able so that these these religious folks are able to speak Resi, right? So that we understand one another and what our needs are without assuming what our needs are, because there's been so much of that in the past. So bridge building is huge. And another example I'll give you is something a little larger than Michigan is the two different committees that we have with the Episcopal Church. When I say the Episcopal Church, like I'm talking the whole doggone church, right? Internationally, we have two different committees that are working together, and we're trying to understand how to create a responsible investigation for for the Episcopal boarding schools, and not just in America, but the Americas, right? Because there was a lot of harm done. And with that, that bridge building is going to be a lot more broad, because we have to go into these communities that we are not familiar with. We don't have aunties in those communities necessarily, but we have to learn how to do that in a responsible way. So that place-based kind of work is going to do a lot of translating, because we're not just going to go into a place over in Hawaii, for example, or Alaska, and they're not going to open us with open arms, so we have to do a lot of respectful asking and showing what our actual intentions are. And that was all of the back to that translating idea.
Well, and that makes sense for a language teacher, right? Someone who so thoughtfully teaches others about Anishinaabe, and I've seen you do this in person. Translating just seems to fit, as well as all of those other elements. And as the person that you are, besides being a language teacher, what about you makes you a natural bridge for people?
I think that curiosity. I'm just always so curious. I really enjoy systems and understanding like how they work, different systems, wide systems, small ones. And I like learning how to reform them. I like seeing what's broken, what's not working, and understanding what those missing pieces are. And so our society has so many systems. Holy, we got so many systems. And I see the different aspects of inadequacy, and I see the different racial disparities, how they fit into these things. And then I see the resources and the want, and all of that wanting to be able to do good from the church's lens. I understand how their systems change can actually be very, very beneficial without the savior syndrome complex. And so I think the curiosity really what drives me and our elders.
I'm so glad you say, like, I'm part European and I'm part Native. Because that's what other people, really colonialism puts that label on us, right? People who are mixed, like we should be the bridges. And not everybody is wants to do that or is appropriate for that, right? It takes a certain mindset, and it takes a certain, as you say, curiosity and grace, certainly. And I think of you that way, as being very graceful in your translation of people. One thing that you mentioned, and I want to touch upon again, is the savior mentality. Explain that to us, because I think a lot of people, we know what that is, right? And we know a lot of people in places of color that understand what the savior mentality is. But in your experience, what is it? And what do you want people who are those potential saviors to know?
Oh, well, that's such a good question. So savior syndrome comes into play so much when you have large organizations or when you have BIPOC people, especially, right? Black, Indigenous people of color, we are oppressed right now, even when it doesn't feel like it, even when we're walking in a grocery store, we're still dealing with that aspects of oppression that aren't just very in your face. And when non-BIPOC people, I'll say, when they see these racial disparities, when they see how we are oppressed, they automatically, oh, I know what, come here, let me help you. They want to mama us sometimes, they want to mama us, they want to take care of us, but that's not necessarily how things are, how they should be helped. They don't, that's not the remedy that's going to have racial justice, social justice, actual change, systemic change. If you have, I'll give an example. If you have a building burned down, a community building, on a res burned down, and then a church nearby says, oh, we really need to go and help them. Let's go build another community center, Yeah, that would be nice, but technically that would be savior syndrome. And when you look at it, when you have these monetary pieces coming from a large entity onto an underrepresented community, that charity turns into an act of oppression. And folks don't really think about it that way because it's creating a hierarchy. Here you go, I'm giving this to you. And then they are going to be looking at this person who does the charity as better, a savior in a way. When really that actual piece that needs to change is the systems need to change. We need to create actual equity. So that's what a large component of a lot of the work is the entities that will be taking part in the savior syndrome that don't understand it. They need this awareness. They need to understand the unconscious bias. They need to understand where their role is and their responsibilities instead of going and come here, I'm gonna mama you, I'm gonna go save you, I'm gonna take care of you. No, don't take care of us. Understand why we're hurting. And you go and you look at these systems and you talk with the people that are in power in these systems, because I know you know them, right? And you tell them how to change these systems so that we are equal, so that there is racial equity, so that we can thrive in the same exact grocery store,
Yeah. I love that example that you gave. And, not to speak poorly of your employers, but isn't the church, whether it's Episcopal or Catholic or any of them, don't they sort of embody that true savior spirit? We know that even that word, the savior, it can come either from like the knight in savior or the soul savior, Jesus or something like that. Um, how does the church, I know that's got to be a challenge, to deal with. How does the church view that?
That's a really good question too. We talk about it very openly in meetings. I'm very, very fortunate to be with a group of real people, that they're ready to hear things, even if they're uncomfortable, and they're ready to learn what that's like for a person who's not white, for a person who doesn't have all the privilege. And I feel very fortunate to be in circles with these people that aren't afraid to talk about the infrastructure versus the individual. I talk about that a lot, looking at the actual infrastructure of our society versus one individual, because that's a huge part that is very hard when you're doing this work, especially for BIPOC people, is that shame that comes along when you talk about privilege, about savior syndrome, about, these very prestigious positions in society. And then our BIPOC people who are not allowed to be out of those positions, So when it comes to the church and being that savior, I think it just comes back to honesty. Talking about honesty and asking them, why are you doing this? Why are we doing this as an entity? And why am I alongside you? And so it's always, we have to keep that truth telling aspect, and we just gotta be real. We have to be really real, especially the bishop I work with. Oh, he's such a good human, Rayford Ray. He is he's a good person that is able to go into a room and just hear what people have to say. And I think that's a huge aspect of taking that savior syndrome out and just having that equity across the line is just observing and listening and not taking that bishop role into the room and being holier than thou, right? He's really doing the systems change even within his diocese by doing small things that are actually big. Like I went into one of the churches one time and he showed me how usually they would have this very beautiful ornate chair and right in the middle, so where the bishop's going to be, right? Instead, he stuck it to the side. You don't want to look at that. He wants to be among your people, right? Or if he has that beautiful staff, because that's what a bishop has. And you want to use that. So we'll put it over here. He wants to be with the people. He wants to be like all the other people, you know. He doesn't want to utilize that hierarchy, which I think is a great, great start. And it's a subtle start so that it's not so obvious. Because sometimes with systems change, that mandatory aspect, ooh, people get so mad. They don't want to do things when they're mandatory, right? But when you create a setting, when you curate that space, it's going to come in natural and it's going to be a lot easier.
I imagine, I mean, in my mind, and full disclosure, I grew up, my mom took me to some churches when I was young. I think we went to Bible school one year, and I went to Catholic school one year. And so I was familiar with a lot of those different ways. My mom grew up Lutheran, and my dad and his family were Catholic. And I always imagine that being told that you have savior syndrome, or having to reconcile this inequity in our society that we've had historically and today, it can be really hard for people to hear when their faith is based on that saviorism, right? I call it soul mining sometimes. And I know that's an awful way of looking at it, but from an Indigenous perspective, we always say, your spirit is one thing that nobody else should be able to, dictate your relationship with your higher power, whatever that might be. And so, the essence of a lot of religion, especially Christian-based religion, has been, to save souls, right? To save people from what they view as hellfire and damnation. And I'm not saying all of them say that, but to save them from a poor afterlife, or a poor, ending to their being. And I can only imagine it must be really hard to have this idea fly in the face of the basis of what their faith is often about. How do you successfully manage that? How do you work with that?
I've been really concentrating on something called reciprocal sacredness. And what I mean by that is understanding what I hold to be sacred just as important as what you hold sacred, right? And when I go into that space, when I go into a church, I do these different congregations, I always remind myself of that, right? I think of if like you and I were to do a water ceremony again, right? How wonderful that feels and how sacred that feels. And we feel like sacred beings as we're there celebrating the water and with the moon and, et cetera, all those manador. It's a beautiful feeling. And when they're there in the pews and they're praying with one another, that's the feeling that they have too. They recognize it with different stories. In a book that has pages, right? Those are their sacred stories. Those are their Atsukamma. And so ours are in here and they're in here. And so recognizing that reciprocal sacredness and teaching them about that, bringing them into that conversation authentically, not in a mandatory way, but inviting them into that space, and inviting them into that conversation, into that heart space, and then having them also practice reciprocal sacredness. Because a lot of folks don't realize that, like, I'm a non-member here, right? I'm a non-Christian, and I'm working in a diocese doing this position. When they learn that, they're just going like, "Whoa! So why are you doing this? Are they converting you? What's going on?" And so that's when we go into. I don't necessarily have to say that word reciprocal sacredness. That could be in our tongue twisters. But I illustrate it through actions, right? And I invite them into that warm heart space. So that's been what's a huge translation for a lot of spaces.
Wonderful. And I imagine that must take like a lot of patience on both parts, and a lot of gentle handling. Do you experience much resistance?
Sometimes. And we're just getting into this work, right? When you look at the long term, oh, we're in the very, very beginning stages. And I know there's going to be a lot more pushback, and there's going to be a lot more obstacles. But there's been like very few that I can think of, you know, that it's not just from one side. I won't say it's just from the church, or it's just from, different native territories, but it's been both. There's been a little pushbacks in both. With the church, it's more like folks are, you're a non-Christian. Why are you allowed to do this work? Why are you allowed in our doors? What are you doing here? What are you up to? Kind of thing. It's they're sometimes skeptical. And that can be hard on the heart because you're just doing hard work to heal others. But you gotta remember that that's their hurt. It's their hurt. And you can't judge a person on their hurt. And then from the native perspective, ooh, some folks are mad that I'm working with the church. They're like, I can't trust you now. What are you doing? Oh my gosh. And I have to bring them into that conversation of, imagine it like this. I tell them, imagine if during these boarding school sessions where they were planning, this is how this is going to go. We're going to have barracks over here. We're going to have the girls over here, and we're going to have the farm over here, right? They're planning. Imagine what it would be like if we had one native person that they would respect in that conversation, how that could have went. If we could have one native person saying, this is going to harm people in this way, in this way, in this way, and here's a better way of how we can do this in a culturally inclusive way. They would say that back in the day. But imagine, right? We need native people in these spaces at all of the tables. It doesn't matter if it's a Christian space, if it's a Jewish space, if it impacts native people, we need to have them in those seats.
Yeah. And I give it to you because I don't know if I could, but it is such heart-centered work that you're doing. And I can see why other people would be triggered by that too, having been harmed by, it doesn't necessarily have to be the Episcopal Church, but by other members of religion too. Um, it can be triggering, but I guess I always look at it too, like the government, the U.S. government, right? We're all citizens of this government and also citizens of our communities or nations. And do we ignore that other citizenship and ignore what's going on around our reservation areas, or do we walk in it, and do we try to change that system, from within too? And so which is really important. People like our Secretary of the Interior, Auntie Deb Haaland, we've seen some things come out of that. We know that we have trusted people in positions that are looking out for us. So you're sort of that person in a way that's looking out for us and for others, for the hearts of others all around you and where you're at. So that's really cool.